My therapist insists I'm her patient who disappeared 15 years ago. Dr. Vivian Cross stared at me from across her office desk with an expression I'd never seen on a therapist's face before. Not concern or professional curiosity, but recognition mixed with something that looked almost like fear. I'd been seeing her for 3 weeks to work through anxiety about my new job when she asked the question that changed everything. Have you ever been to Seattle, specifically between 2008 and 2010? I told her no, that I'd lived in Chicago my entire life except for college in Boston. She leaned forward and her hands were shaking slightly when she opened a drawer and pulled out an old photograph. She set it on the desk between us and I looked down at a young woman who could have been my twin. Same dark hair, same angular face, same small mole near my left eye. The photograph was dated April 2009, written in pen on the back. Dr. Cross's voice came out strained when she spoke again. This is Natalie Brenner. She was my patient for 18 months starting in late 2008. She came to me with severe trauma from her childhood. We made real progress together. Then one day in June 2010, she didn't show up for her appointment and I never saw her again. Her apartment was cleared out. Her phone was disconnected. She vanished completely. I stared at the photograph, feeling my chest tighten because the resemblance was impossible to ignore. But I wasn't Natalie Brenner. I was Grace Ashford, born and raised in Chicago, with parents and school records and a whole documented life that had nothing to do with Seattle or 2010. Dr. Cross kept the photograph on her desk between us, and I watched her study my face with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. She asked about scars I might have, birthmarks, anything physical that could confirm identity. I told her about the appendectomy scar I got when I was 12, and the small burn mark on my right hand from a cooking accident in college. She wrote these down carefully, and I realized this felt less like therapy and more like an interrogation. I asked why she thought I was this Natalie person, and she explained that the resemblance was just the beginning. Apparently, I had similar mannerisms to Natalie. The way I tucked my hair behind my left ear when nervous, how I crossed my ankles when sitting, small gestures that seemed too specific to be coincidence. I felt anger rising because I'd come here for help with work anxiety, and instead my therapist was insisting I was someone else. I told her firmly that I was Grace Ashford, that I had a birth certificate and a social security number, and decades of memories proving who I was. Dr. Cross nodded slowly, but I could see she didn't believe me. She asked if I'd be willing to take a DNA test, just to rule out the possibility. I should have walked out right then, should have reported her to whatever board oversees therapists. But something about the desperate hope in her face made me hesitate. She said Natalie's disappearance had haunted her for 15 years, that she'd filed missing person reports and hired investigators and never stopped wondering what happened to her patient. I agreed to the DNA test mostly to prove her wrong and end this strange accusation. Dr. Cross gave me information for a lab where I could have a sample taken. She said she had DNA from Natalie's old apartment that she'd kept all these years, items Natalie had left behind before vanishing. I asked what kind of therapist keeps biological evidence for 15 years, and she admitted it wasn't standard practice. That she'd held on to Natalie's belongings because she felt responsible for her disappearance somehow. That if she'd been a better therapist, maybe Natalie wouldn't have run. I left her office feeling shaken and confused. When I got home to my apartment, I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror trying to see this Natalie person Dr. Cross kept talking about. The resemblance in the photograph was striking, but lots of people looked similar. The world was full of doppelgangers and coincidental twins. That didn't make me someone who'd disappeared from Seattle 15 years ago. I called my mother that evening and asked her strange questions about my birth. Where exactly was I born? Which hospital? Did she have my original birth certificate? My mother sounded confused and concerned, asking why I was suddenly questioning my own existence. I made up an excuse about needing documents for work and she promised to look through her files. That night I couldn't sleep because Dr. Cross's certainty had planted doubt in my mind about something that should have been absolute. The DNA test came back 3 days later, and I opened the results sitting at my kitchen table with my hands shaking. The lab report was dense with technical language, but the conclusion was clear. The samples were not a match. I felt relief flood through me, followed immediately by anger. Dr. Cross had been wrong. I wasn't Natalie Brenner. I was exactly who I'd always known myself to be. I called her office to schedule an appointment so I could show her the results and demand an apology for putting me through this bizarre experience. Her receptionist scheduled me for the following afternoon. When I arrived, Dr. Cross looked like she hadn't slept. Her office was messier than usual with files spread across her desk. She asked if I had the DNA results and I handed them over, feeling vindicated. She read through them carefully and I watched confusion cross her face. "This doesn't make sense," she said quietly. "The resemblance is too exact. These mannerisms are too specific." I told her that sometimes people just looked similar, and that I'd proven I wasn't her missing patient so we could move on. But Dr. Cross opened a file on her desk and started pulling out more photographs of Natalie. Dozens of them documenting therapy sessions over 18 months. In every single image, Natalie could have been me at a younger age, the same face from different angles and different lights, wearing different clothes. It was disturbing how exact the resemblance was. Dr. Cross asked if I'd be willing to listen to something and pulled out an old recording device. She explained that she'd recorded many of her sessions with Natalie with permission for treatment purposes. She wanted me to hear Natalie's voice. I almost refused because this whole situation felt increasingly inappropriate, but curiosity won. Dr. Cross pressed play and a voice came through the small speaker. It sounded exactly like mine. Same pitch, same cadence, same slight Chicago accent that I'd always had even though Natalie supposedly lived in Seattle. The recording was from a session in March 2010, and Natalie was talking about nightmares she kept having. Nightmares about a basement and a man's voice and feeling trapped. I felt my skin crawl listening to this because it was my voice describing dreams I'd never had. Dr. Cross stopped the recording and asked if I recognized anything Natalie was describing. I shook my head, but I was lying because something about the basement description felt familiar in a way I couldn't explain. I told Dr. Cross I wanted to stop seeing her as my therapist, that this situation was unethical and harmful and I needed to find someone else. She agreed immediately and apologized for overstepping professional boundaries. But then she asked if I'd be willing to meet with her informally, not as patient and therapist, but as two people trying to solve a mystery. She said she'd pay me for my time. I should have said no and walked away. Instead, I found myself agreeing to meet her again the following week at a coffee shop instead of her office. The money she offered was good and my new job wasn't paying enough to cover my rent comfortably. But really, I agreed because hearing that recording had unsettled me. The voice that sounded exactly like mine talking about nightmares that felt almost familiar. I needed to understand what was happening even if the DNA test had proved I wasn't Natalie. The coffee shop meeting felt surreal. Dr. Cross arrived with a thick folder full of documents about Natalie's life and disappearance. She spread them across the table and started explaining what she knew. Natalie had come to Seattle in 2008 with no family connections and no history anyone could verify. She'd paid for therapy in cash and had no health insurance. She worked remotely as a copy editor for various online publications. Everything about Natalie's life had been deliberately vague and disconnected. When she disappeared in June 2010, Dr. Cross had tried to find her through every method possible, but Natalie Brenner seemed to have no existence before Seattle. No birth records, no school transcripts, no paper trail of any kind. Dr. Cross had eventually hired a private investigator who concluded that Natalie Brenner was likely an assumed name, that the woman who came to therapy was using a false identity. The investigator's report was in the folder, and I read through it carefully. According to his findings, Natalie had set up her entire Seattle life using fake documentation. The social security number she'd used for her apartment rental was invalid. Her references for employment were phone numbers that led to voicemail boxes that never got returned. She'd essentially created a ghost identity that looked legitimate on the surface but dissolved under investigation. The investigator theorized that Natalie was either in witness protection or running from something in her past. Dr. Cross said she'd always wondered if Natalie had been fleeing an abusive relationship or escaping some kind of danger. That would explain the fake identity and the sudden disappearance. I asked why Dr. Cross was so obsessed with finding Natalie after 15 years. She admitted that Natalie's disappearance had happened right after a breakthrough session where Natalie had started to remember details about her childhood trauma, specifically about being held in a basement for extended periods by a family member. Dr. Cross felt that her therapeutic intervention had triggered something that caused Natalie to run. She'd carried guilt about this for 15 years, wondering if she'd pushed too hard or uncovered something so painful that Natalie chose to vanish rather than face it. I spent the next week thinking about Natalie Brenner and her fake identity and her sudden disappearance. Something about the story bothered me beyond the strange resemblance. The detail about being held in a basement kept circling in my mind. I had my own childhood memories that were fuzzy and incomplete, gaps that my parents explained as normal memory formation. Everyone forgets parts of their early childhood, they said, but I'd always felt that my gaps were different, too long and too empty. I'd been a late talker, according to my mother, didn't speak in full sentences until I was almost 4 years old, had night terrors until I was 7. My parents attributed this to me being a sensitive child, but now I wondered if there was more to it. I decided to visit my parents in Chicago and ask them directly about my early childhood. The drive from my apartment to their house took 40 minutes, and I used the time to rehearse questions that wouldn't sound accusatory. When I arrived, my mother was in the garden and my father was reading in his study. They seemed genuinely happy to see me, and we had lunch together before I brought up the reason for my visit. I asked about my birth certificate and baby photos and early medical records. My mother said most of the documents were stored in the attic, but she could look for them. We climbed the narrow stairs to the attic, and I watched my mother search through labeled boxes. She found my baby book first, and we sat on the dusty floor looking through photos of me as an infant. Except something was wrong. The baby in the photos looked like me, but the backgrounds were unfamiliar. I asked my mother about the hospital in the birth photos, and she said I was born at Chicago General. But the signage visible in one photo said something different. I pointed this out and watched my mother's face go pale. She closed the book quickly and said she must have been confused about which hospital, that it had been so long ago and maybe I was actually born at a different facility. Her reaction made my chest tight because I could see she was lying. I pressed her for the truth, asking why she was being evasive about simple facts. My mother started crying and said she'd promised never to tell me, that my father and her had agreed it was better if I never knew. I felt rage and fear mixing together as I demanded to know what she was talking about. She told me to wait and went back downstairs. I could hear her talking to my father in urgent whispers. Then both of them came up to the attic looking like they'd aged 10 years in 10 minutes. My father sat down on an old trunk and took a deep breath before speaking. He told me that they'd adopted me when I was 3 years old through a private adoption, that my biological parents had been unable to care for me and had given me up through a lawyer who specialized in these arrangements. My parents had wanted a child desperately after years of infertility, and when the opportunity came, they'd taken it without asking too many questions. They'd been told that a clean break was best for everyone, that I'd been through trauma in my early childhood, and the adoption gave me a fresh start with a new name and a new life. They'd raised me as Grace Ashford and never told me about the adoption because they wanted me to feel secure and loved without the burden of knowing I'd been given away. I sat there processing this information and feeling like my entire identity was dissolving. Everything I'd thought I knew about myself was based on a lie. I asked what my original name had been, and my parents said they didn't know. The adoption had been sealed and the records were confidential. All they had was a first name my biological mother had called me, Natalie. The room started spinning and I had to grip the floor to steady myself. Dr. Cross had been right. I was Natalie Brenner. Or I had been before my adoption at age 3, before I became Grace Ashford and forgot everything that came before. The revelation felt like being split in two. Part of me was still Grace Ashford with 28 years of memories and identity. But another part of me was Natalie Brenner, who disappeared from Seattle 15 years ago after recovering traumatic childhood memories. I demanded that my parents tell me everything they knew about the adoption. My father explained that they'd gone through a lawyer named David Sutton, who'd since passed away. Sutton specialized in private adoptions where biological parents wanted to place children without going through the state system. He told my parents that my biological mother was young and unable to care for me, that there were no other family members who could take custody. The adoption had cost them $50,000, which they'd saved for years to afford. I asked why the adoption had been so expensive if it was legitimate, and my mother said private adoptions were always costly. But I could see doubt in her face now. Could see her wondering if they'd paid that money for something less legitimate than they'd believed. I asked if they had any documentation from the adoption, and my father went to his study to retrieve a file he'd kept locked in his desk for 25 years. The file was thin, containing only a few documents. An adoption decree signed by a judge in Indiana. My new birth certificate issued when I was 3 listing my parents as my biological parents. A medical report from a doctor I'd never met stating I was healthy and developing normally. No information about my biological parents. No explanation for why they'd given me up. Just paperwork that erased Natalie and created Grace. I photographed every document with my phone and told my parents I needed time to process this. My mother begged me not to hate them for keeping the secret. She said they'd done what they thought was best, that they'd given me a stable, loving home, and that had to count for something. I didn't have words to respond. I left their house and drove back to my apartment in a daze. Everything felt different now. The walls of my apartment seemed to belong to someone else. My reflection in the mirror was a stranger. I'd spent 28 years being Grace Ashford, and now I had to confront that Grace was just a name given to a traumatized 3-year-old who'd been sold to people desperate for a child. I called Dr. Cross and told her we needed to meet immediately, that she'd been right about everything. Dr. Cross met me at the same coffee shop looking both vindicated and devastated. I explained what my parents had told me about the adoption, how I'd been Natalie before becoming Grace, how the entire foundation of my identity had been constructed on sealed records and deliberate amnesia. Dr. Cross pulled out her folder again and we started piecing together a timeline. I'd been adopted at age 3 in 2000. Natalie Brenner appeared in Seattle in 2008 when I would have been 25 years old. For 25 years, I'd lived as Grace Ashford with no memory of being Natalie. Then something had happened to trigger those memories. Something that made me research my past and discover the adoption. I must have tracked my history back to Seattle and started therapy with Dr. Cross under my original name, trying to recover the memories that had been buried for decades. But when the memories started coming back during our sessions, when I started remembering the basement and the trauma, I'd panicked and run, created another new identity, and disappeared to protect myself from whatever I'd uncovered. Dr. Cross asked if I remembered any of this, and I told her no. My memories started around age 4 or 5. Everything before that was just darkness. She said recovered memories were complicated and controversial, that the mind protected itself from trauma by creating amnesia, that I might never remember what happened before my adoption, or what drove me to Seattle in 2008. I spent that night reading everything I could find about recovered memories and childhood trauma. The research suggested that children who experienced severe trauma before age 4 often had complete amnesia about the events. The brain's memory systems weren't fully developed, and trauma could fragment what little memory formation existed. Some people recovered these memories in adulthood through therapy or triggering events. Others never remembered at all. I thought about the Natalie who'd gone to Seattle seeking answers. She must have discovered something about her adoption and decided to investigate. Must have found Dr. Cross somehow and started therapy to unlock the memories. Then when the memories started surfacing, when she began remembering whatever happened in that basement, the fear had overwhelmed her, and she'd run. She'd abandoned her fake identity in Seattle and disappeared. But where had she gone? What happened to Natalie between June 2010 and now? I realized I needed to find out what triggered Natalie's original investigation. What made Grace Ashford start questioning her identity after 25 years of accepting the adoption story? I called my parents and asked if anything significant had happened around 2008. Any family deaths or discoveries that might have prompted questions. My mother thought for a moment and then remembered. Her own mother, my grandmother, had died in March 2008. While sorting through her belongings, they'd found letters. I drove back to my parents' house the next morning demanding to see these letters. My mother retrieved a small box from her closet containing correspondence between my grandmother and someone named Elizabeth Brenner, spanning from 1997 to 2005. I read through them with growing horror. Elizabeth Brenner was apparently my biological mother, and she'd been writing to my grandmother for years after the adoption. The letters revealed a different story than what my parents had been told. Elizabeth hadn't willingly given me up. I'd been taken from her by Child Protective Services after someone reported suspected abuse. Elizabeth had been investigated and deemed unfit, but she'd maintained her innocence. She'd written to my grandmother begging to know if I was okay, if I was being treated well, if I remembered her. My grandmother had responded coldly, telling Elizabeth to accept that she'd lost custody and to stop contacting the family. But Elizabeth kept writing, kept insisting that she hadn't hurt me, that someone else had been responsible for my trauma, that she'd been trying to protect me when CPS intervened. The last letter was dated August 2005, and Elizabeth wrote that she was sick, that she probably didn't have much time left, but she wanted my grandmother to tell me the truth when I was old enough, that I deserved to know what really happened. My grandmother never responded to that letter. I felt rage at my grandmother for keeping these letters hidden, for knowing that my biological mother had been trying to reach me and refusing to help. I asked my parents if they'd known about the letters, and they swore they hadn't, that they'd only discovered them after my grandmother died, and by then it had been years since the last letter. They'd made the decision not to tell me because they thought it would just cause pain, that Elizabeth was probably dead by now anyway, and there was no point in disturbing my peace. I told them they'd had no right to make that decision for me, that I was an adult who deserved to know my own history. My mother started crying again, and my father looked broken. They'd genuinely believed they were protecting me, but their protection had been another form of harm. I took the box of letters and left. Back in my apartment, I read through each letter multiple times. Elizabeth's handwriting was shaky and desperate. She described loving me more than anything, described fighting the system that took me away, described someone named Richard who she claimed was the real danger. But she never fully explained who Richard was or what he'd done, just kept saying that she'd tried to protect me from him, and that's why CPS had gotten involved. The vague references frustrated me because I needed concrete information. I needed to understand what happened before I could figure out what Natalie had discovered in 2008. I decided to research Elizabeth Brenner. If the last letter was from 2005 saying she was sick, she might have died soon after. I searched death records and found Elizabeth Marie Brenner, who died in October 2007 in Portland, Oregon. The obituary was brief, mentioning no surviving family members. She'd been 51 years old. I felt grief for this woman I didn't remember who'd apparently loved me and fought for me and died alone. If Elizabeth died in October 2007, that timing connected to Grace discovering the letters in March 2008. I must have found my grandmother's correspondence and learned about Elizabeth. Then I must have investigated further and discovered my original name was Natalie Brenner. That discovery had triggered something that made me travel to Seattle under my birth name, trying to recover my memories through therapy. But why Seattle specifically? I searched for connections between Elizabeth Brenner and Seattle. Found nothing obvious. Then I searched for Richard and Seattle and Elizabeth's name combined. Still nothing. I was missing some crucial piece of information that explained the Seattle connection. I called Dr. Cross and asked if Natalie had ever mentioned why she chose Seattle or how she'd found Dr. Cross's practice. Dr. Cross thought back to their early sessions and remembered. Natalie had said she was in Seattle because someone told her to go there, that she was following a lead about her past. Dr. Cross asked if I wanted to listen to more of the recorded sessions. She said maybe something Natalie had revealed during therapy would help us understand what lead she'd been following. I agreed, and she brought over a box of old cassette tapes labeled with dates from 2008 to 2010. We sat in my apartment listening to Natalie's voice, my voice, talking about fragments of memories and feelings that were starting to surface. In a session from November 2009, Natalie mentioned having dreams about a woman who smelled like lavender soap. A woman who sang lullabies in a language Natalie didn't recognize. Dr. Cross had asked if this could be her mother, and Natalie said maybe, but the woman in her dreams seemed older, like a grandmother or aunt. Another session from January 2010 had Natalie describing the basement memory in more detail. She said it was cold and dark, that she could hear footsteps above her, that someone brought her food once a day but never spoke. The fear in her voice was visceral, and I felt sick listening to my own terror from 15 years ago. In March 2010, just 3 months before her disappearance, Natalie had a breakthrough. She remembered a name, Richard Ashford, her voice shaking as she said it, saying she didn't know who Richard Ashford was, but the name made her feel sick with fear. I stopped the recording and stared at Dr. Cross. Richard Ashford was my father's name, my adoptive father who'd raised me for 25 years, the man who'd read to me as a child and taught me to ride a bike and paid for my college education. Dr. Cross saw my expression and asked what was wrong. I told her that Richard was my adoptive father, and I watched her face go pale. We both understood what this meant. Before I was adopted, before I was 3 years old, something had happened involving Richard Ashford. Something traumatic enough to be buried in my memory. Something that Elizabeth Brenner had been trying to protect me from. I felt my hands shaking as I pulled out my phone to call my mother. I needed answers immediately, and I wasn't going to be gentle about asking for them. My mother answered on the third ring, sounding tired. I asked her directly if Richard had known me before the adoption, if there was any connection between our family and Elizabeth Brenner before the adoption proceedings. The silence on the other end of the line lasted too long. Then my mother started crying and said we needed to talk in person, that this wasn't something she could explain over the phone. I told her I was coming over right now and hung up. Dr. Cross offered to drive because my hands were shaking too badly to be safe behind a wheel. The drive to my parents' house felt endless. Dr. Cross tried to prepare me for what we might discover. She said that sometimes abuse happened within families, that Richard might have been a relative who'd harmed me before the adoption, that the adoption itself might have been a way to cover up what he'd done. I felt rage building because if Richard had hurt me as a child and then somehow arranged to adopt me, that was beyond monstrous. That was systematic abuse protected by legal mechanisms. When we arrived, both my parents were sitting in the living room looking like they'd been expecting this confrontation. I stood in their doorway with Dr. Cross beside me and demanded the complete truth. No more evasions or partial explanations. I needed to know exactly how Richard was connected to Natalie Brenner and Elizabeth, and what had happened before my adoption. My mother looked at Richard and he nodded slowly. He started talking, and what he said ripped apart everything I'd thought I understood. Richard explained that he'd been Elizabeth's boyfriend for 2 years, that I was his biological daughter, that he and Elizabeth had lived together from when I was born until I was 18 months old. He'd loved Elizabeth and had been planning to propose. But then Elizabeth started acting paranoid and erratic. She'd accused him of trying to hurt me, had taken me and fled their shared apartment in Indiana, had hidden from him for over a year while he searched frantically. Richard said he'd finally found us in a terrible apartment where Elizabeth was clearly not coping well. I was 2.5 years old, malnourished and barely verbal. He'd called Child Protective Services because he was genuinely afraid for my safety. CPS had investigated and found evidence that I'd been locked in a basement as punishment when I cried. Elizabeth had been arrested and I'd been placed in emergency foster care. Richard had petitioned for custody, but the courts were slow. By the time everything was processed, I was 3 years old and had been in foster care for 6 months. Richard had met my mother, Sharon, during this period. They'd bonded over his situation and had fallen in love. When he finally got custody, they'd decided to get married and raise me together. They'd legally changed my name to Grace, and Sharon had adopted me as well. They'd moved to a new city to give everyone a fresh start. They genuinely believed they were rescuing me from an abusive situation, that Elizabeth was unstable and dangerous, that their lies about the adoption being from strangers had been meant to protect me from knowing my biological mother had been deemed unfit. I listened to this story feeling like I was drowning. Everything was inverted from what I'd thought. Richard wasn't a predator who'd hurt me. He was supposedly my biological father who'd saved me. Elizabeth wasn't a loving mother wrongfully accused. She was supposedly abusive and mentally ill. I asked why Elizabeth's letters had claimed Richard was dangerous if this story was true. Sharon said that Elizabeth had been delusional, that she'd created a false narrative where she was the victim and Richard was the villain, that her mental illness had made her unable to accept responsibility for what she'd done. Richard added that he'd tried to get Elizabeth help but she'd refused treatment, that she'd chosen to see herself as persecuted rather than face the reality of her actions. I wanted to believe them because these were the people who'd raised me, but something felt wrong about their story. Too convenient, too neatly explaining away every contradiction. I asked to see the CPS records from my removal from Elizabeth's care. Richard and Sharon exchanged looks and said the records had been sealed, that they didn't have access to them. I told them I'd petition to have them unsealed as the child involved. They tried to discourage this, saying it would be traumatic to read those reports, that some things were better left buried. But I was done accepting their version of what was better for me. I told them I was going to investigate everything and discover the truth about what really happened. Dr. Cross and I left their house and sat in her car processing what we'd heard. She said Richard's story was plausible but concerning, that the detail about me being locked in a basement matched what Natalie had started remembering in therapy. But it also seemed suspicious that Richard and Sharon had so thoroughly erased my history and cut off all contact with Elizabeth. I spent the next 3 weeks filing petitions to unseal the CPS records from my removal. The process was complicated, requiring court appearances and proving I was the minor referenced in the sealed files. My parents tried to contact me multiple times, but I refused to speak with them until I had objective documentation of what had happened. Dr. Cross stayed in contact, checking on me regularly. She said what I was going through was intensely traumatic and I needed support. But I'd stopped trusting therapists after discovering that my own identity had been manipulated for decades. Finally, the court granted my petition, and I received copies of the CPS investigation from 1999. The files were extensive, and what they contained made me physically ill. The initial report had come from a neighbor who heard me crying for hours and then not hearing anything for days. When CPS investigated, they'd found me locked in a basement with Elizabeth, claiming she was protecting me from Richard. She'd said Richard had hurt me and she needed to keep me hidden until she could flee. She'd been locking me in the basement whenever she thought he might come to the apartment. The CPS worker had documented bruises on my body that Elizabeth claimed came from Richard during his visits. But the worker noted that Elizabeth's story kept changing and seemed paranoid. Medical examination showed I was malnourished and had signs of neglect, but the bruises were consistent with falling, not abuse. Further investigation revealed that Richard had been paying child support and trying to arrange supervised visitation, that he'd been cooperative with authorities and concerned about my welfare. Elizabeth had repeatedly refused to allow visits and had violated custody orders. A psychiatric evaluation ordered by the court found Elizabeth had paranoid delusions and believed Richard was part of a conspiracy to take me away from her. The psychologist recommended removal from Elizabeth's care and supervised reunification therapy. But Elizabeth refused all services and her parental rights were eventually terminated. Richard had been granted full custody, and the file ended with a note that I'd been placed with him and his new wife in Chicago. The records seemed to support Richard's version of events completely. Elizabeth had been mentally ill and had harmed me through neglect while trying to protect me from imagined threats. Richard had been the responsible parent who saved me. I should have felt relief that my adoptive father wasn't actually an abuser, but something still felt wrong. I read through the files again more carefully and noticed discrepancies. The dates didn't quite align. Elizabeth's story had changed, but so had Richard's in subtle ways, and the psychologist's evaluation seemed rushed with minimal actual evaluation time documented. I took the files to Dr. Cross and asked her professional opinion. She read through everything twice, then pointed out something I'd missed. The CPS worker who'd handled my case was a woman named Jennifer Strauss. Dr. Cross said that name was familiar. She pulled out her old notes from Natalie's therapy sessions and found it. In April 2010, Natalie had mentioned finding someone named Jenny Strauss in Seattle. She'd said Jenny was a lead. Dr. Cross said Seattle must have been where Jennifer Strauss moved after leaving Indiana, that Natalie had tracked her down to get answers about what really happened in 1999. I searched for Jennifer Strauss in Seattle and found an obituary from August 2010. She died at age 58 from liver failure related to alcoholism. The timing was staggering. Natalie disappeared in June 2010. Jennifer Strauss died 2 months later. Dr. Cross said we needed to find out if Natalie had actually met with Jennifer before her death, if Jennifer had told Natalie something that made her run. I contacted the funeral home listed in the obituary and asked if they had any information about Jennifer's final weeks. The funeral director remembered her case because Jennifer had been alone at the end with no family. But she'd had one visitor shortly before her death, a young woman who'd come several times asking about Jennifer's work history. I asked if the visitor had left a name, and the director checked old sign-in sheets. The name listed was Natalie Brenner. So Natalie had found Jennifer and visited her multiple times before Jennifer's death. She must have learned something crucial from those conversations. I flew to Seattle to investigate further. Dr. Cross came with me, saying this was as much her mystery as mine now. We visited the hospice facility where Jennifer had died and spoke with a nurse who remembered her. The nurse said Jennifer had been consumed with guilt in her final weeks, that she'd talked constantly about a case from years ago where she'd made a mistake, about a little girl she'd failed to protect. The nurse said Jennifer had told the young visitor Natalie everything, and after those visits Jennifer had seemed both relieved and devastated. I asked what Jennifer had confessed to, and the nurse said Jennifer never gave her specific details, just that she'd falsified reports under pressure, that she'd been paid to write evaluations that protected the wrong person, that a child had been given to an abuser and she'd been too weak to stop it. The nurse remembered Jennifer saying the young visitor had been kind, had forgiven her even though forgiveness wasn't deserved. After Jennifer died, the visitor had never come back. I felt cold understanding wash over me. Jennifer had been paid to falsify my CPS records, to paint Elizabeth as mentally ill and Richard as the good father, to ensure I was placed with Richard despite evidence that he was the actual abuser. Richard had bought my custody the same way he'd later bought my adoption, with money and manipulation and corrupt officials. I called my mother Sharon from the Seattle hotel room and asked her a direct question. Had she known that Richard was my biological father when they got married? Was their entire relationship based on him needing a respectable wife to complete the adoption picture? Sharon broke down crying and admitted she'd suspected the truth for years, that she'd found documents early in their marriage showing Richard had paid Jennifer Strauss $50,000, the same amount they'd supposedly paid the adoption lawyer. She'd confronted Richard and he'd convinced her it was necessary to protect me from Elizabeth's instability, that the system was corrupt and slow and he'd done what was needed to save his daughter. Sharon had wanted to believe him because she loved me, because I'd seemed happy and healthy in their home. She'd told herself that the ends justified the means, that Richard was genuinely a good father regardless of how he'd obtained custody. Over the years, she'd pushed down her doubts and focused on raising me, but when I'd found the letters in 2008, she'd known the truth would eventually come out. I asked if Richard had abused me before Elizabeth took me away. Sharon said she'd never seen any evidence of abuse, that Richard had always been gentle with me, but she admitted she didn't know what had happened before she'd met him, that he refused to talk about that period in detail. I hung up and told Dr. Cross what Sharon had confirmed. We sat in silence for a long time processing the implications. Richard had paid to have me taken from Elizabeth, had manipulated the system to obtain custody, had erased my identity and my history to maintain control. But what had he done before that to make Elizabeth flee with me in the first place? What had I remembered in therapy that made Natalie so terrified she'd disappeared? Dr. Cross said we needed to find out what happened to Natalie after she left Seattle. Where did she go between June 2010 and now? I realized that if I was Natalie, then I must have created another identity after leaving Seattle. Just like I'd created Natalie after being Grace. I must have a pattern of running and renaming when I got too close to dangerous truths. Dr. Cross suggested we search for women matching my description who appeared in records around 2010 with no prior history. Women who might be me under another name. We spent 2 days searching through databases and public records, looking for identity patterns similar to what we'd found with Natalie in Seattle. Finally, we found a possibility. A woman named Sophie Dunn who'd appeared in Denver in August 2010 with minimal documentation, who'd worked remotely and paid cash and kept a low profile. Sophie had lived in Denver until 2014, then disappeared completely. No forwarding address, no job termination, just gone. If I'd been Sophie from 2010 to 2014, that meant I'd spent 4 years hiding in Denver after fleeing Seattle. What had I been running from? And what made Sophie disappear in 2014? I searched for connections to Richard Ashford in Denver. Found nothing obvious. Then Dr. Cross suggested we check missing persons reports from 2014. If someone had been looking for Sophie, that might explain why she ran. We found it in a missing person report filed by Richard Ashford in March 2014. He'd reported his adult daughter Grace Ashford missing, claiming she'd had a mental breakdown and disappeared. He'd provided my photo and description and had been actively searching for me through private investigators. The report said Grace was vulnerable and potentially suicidal, that she needed to be found for her own safety. I felt rage so intense I couldn't speak. Richard had used the system to hunt me down when I was trying to escape him, had framed me as mentally ill and dangerous to myself to justify tracking me. Dr. Cross said this pattern was common in abusive situations. The abuser maintains control by claiming the victim is unstable, by using institutional authority to enforce that control. Richard must have found Sophie somehow in 2014, forcing her to run again, to create yet another identity and disappear. I was supposedly Grace Ashford now, but I had no memory of being Sophie or Natalie, which meant each time I ran and renamed, I must have suppressed the memories to protect myself. Dr. Cross had a theory. She said dissociative amnesia was a known response to severe trauma, that people could create separate identities as a coping mechanism, that I might have multiple identity states that didn't communicate with each other. Grace had no memory of being Sophie, who had no memory of being Natalie, who had no memory of the original trauma. Each version of me was trying to escape the truth, but the truth kept finding me. I needed to recover all the memories to understand the complete picture. Dr. Cross offered to work with me on this, but warned it would be dangerous, that whatever I remembered might be devastating. I told her I needed to know even if the truth destroyed me. We started intensive therapy sessions focused on recovering my lost identities. Dr. Cross used techniques to help me access memories that had been compartmentalized. At first, nothing came. My mind resisted going back to Sophie or Natalie or beyond, but gradually fragments emerged. I started remembering Denver as Sophie, working from a small apartment and feeling constantly afraid, watching for Richard everywhere. The memory of how Sophie disappeared came back suddenly and completely. Richard had found me, had shown up at my apartment with proof that he'd legally tracked me down. He'd tried to force me to come back to Chicago for treatment, said I was sick and needed help. I'd fled in the night, leaving everything behind, had hitchhiked to a new city and eventually ended up back in Chicago under yet another identity. Grace. Living close to the people I was running from, because sometimes the best hiding place is right under someone's nose. The memories of Natalie came next. I remembered being in Seattle, in therapy with Dr. Cross, starting to recover the original trauma. I remembered visiting Jennifer Strauss in hospice. Jennifer had been dying and guilty and had finally told me the truth. That Richard had paid her to remove me from Elizabeth's custody. That Elizabeth's psychiatric evaluation had been falsified. That I'd actually been taken from a safe situation and given to my abuser. Jennifer had cried while telling me this, saying she'd been desperate for money back then, going through a divorce, drowning in debt. Richard had offered her $50,000 to write the reports he needed. She'd told herself it was just paperwork, that she'd investigate properly, and if Richard really was abusive, she wouldn't go through with it. But Richard had been convincing, had presented as the concerned father with a crazy ex, had coached me to be calm and happy during the one supervised visit, Jennifer observed. She'd written the reports recommending my placement with him and had taken the money. It wasn't until years later that she'd understood what she'd done, that she'd sold a child to her abuser. Jennifer had spent the last 20 years drinking to drown her guilt. When I'd found her and confronted her, she'd been relieved to finally confess. But her confession had made everything worse for me, because now I knew for certain that Richard was the danger Elizabeth had been trying to protect me from. That I'd been forced to live with my abuser for my entire conscious life. That the man I called father was the source of my original trauma. The memory of what Richard had done to me before Elizabeth fled came back in pieces over several sessions. It was fragmented and incomplete because I'd been so young. But the core of it was there. Richard had hurt me, had locked me in the basement when I cried, had told Elizabeth I needed to learn discipline. Elizabeth had believed him at first because she was young and thought he knew better about parenting. But then she'd noticed I was becoming fearful and withdrawn. She'd found bruises on my body that Richard dismissed as normal childhood injuries. The final incident that made her flee had happened when I was 18 months old. She'd come home early from work and found me locked in the basement again. She'd confronted Richard, and he'd admitted he sometimes left me down there for hours when I was too fussy. Elizabeth had grabbed me and run, had spent the next year hiding and trying to figure out how to prove what Richard had done. But she had no evidence. No photographs of the bruises because Richard had convinced her not to be an overprotective mother who documented every scrape. No witnesses because Richard had been careful to only hurt me when they were alone. Just a terrified mother's word against a father who presented as reasonable and concerned. When CPS got involved, Elizabeth had tried to explain about the basement and Richard's abuse, but Jennifer's falsified reports made Elizabeth look paranoid and delusional. The same tactics had been used to take me away from the parent trying to protect me and give me to the parent who'd harmed me. I sat in Dr. Cross's office processing these recovered memories and feeling completely shattered. My entire life had been built on a foundation of abuse and manipulation. The man I'd thought was my loving father had been my original abuser. The mother I'd never known had been trying to save me, and I'd been forced to forget everything and live with my abuser for 25 years thinking he was my savior. Dr. Cross asked what I wanted to do with this information. I could go to the police, but the statute of limitations on child abuse from 3 decades ago had likely expired. I could confront Richard, but that might be dangerous. Or I could focus on healing and building a life separate from everyone who'd harmed me. I told Dr. Cross that I wanted justice even if the legal system couldn't provide it, that Richard had stolen my life and needed to face consequences. She warned me that going after Richard could be risky, that he'd demonstrated he was willing to manipulate systems and hunt me down, that I needed to be careful. I said I understood the risks, but I couldn't keep running, that each time I'd created a new identity, I'd lost more of myself, that Grace and Sophie and Natalie were all fragments of a person who'd been broken before she had the chance to be whole. The only way forward was through the truth, no matter how painful. I started by documenting everything. I wrote down all the recovered memories, collected the falsified CPS reports, found Jennifer Strauss's confession in hospice records, built a timeline showing how Richard had systematically manipulated the system to obtain custody. I contacted a lawyer who specialized in adult survivors of childhood abuse and explained the situation. The lawyer confirmed that criminal prosecution was unlikely after 3 decades, but she said there might be civil remedies, that I could sue Richard for fraud regarding the adoption, could potentially have the adoption nullified on grounds that it was obtained through illegal means, could seek damages for the psychological harm caused by his abuse and subsequent cover-up. The lawyer warned that this would be difficult to prove and Richard would fight it, but she thought I had enough documentation to build a case. I filed the civil suit in September. Richard's lawyer immediately filed motions to dismiss, claiming the allegations were fabricated and based on false memories. They argued that recovered memories were unreliable and that I'd been manipulated by an unethical therapist. They brought in expert witnesses to testify that Dr. Cross had implanted false memories through suggestive therapy techniques. The legal battle became brutal. Richard and Sharon both testified that they'd been loving parents who'd given me every advantage, that I'd been a happy child with no signs of trauma until recently when I'd started therapy and developed these delusions. I sat in court listening to Richard describe saving me from Elizabeth's abuse, listened to him paint himself as the hero of my story. My lawyer presented Jennifer Strauss's hospice records showing her confession, presented the payment records showing Richard had paid her $50,000 the same month she wrote the CPS reports, presented the timeline showing how I'd repeatedly fled and created new identities whenever Richard got too close. The judge seemed skeptical but willing to hear all evidence. The case took 8 months to work through the courts. During that time, I kept having more recovered memories. I remembered Richard's house in Chicago where I'd lived from age 3 onward. Remembered the basement that had always made me uncomfortable without knowing why. Remembered Richard's controlling behavior that my child self had interpreted as fatherly concern but was actually surveillance, making sure I never remembered, never questioned, never escaped. I remembered why I'd started investigating in 2008 after finding Elizabeth's letters. One of the letters had mentioned the basement, and that single word had triggered a fragment of memory. I'd started having nightmares about being locked in the dark, had started researching my adoption, had discovered I was Natalie Brenner and had decided to investigate under that name so Richard wouldn't know what I was doing. Everything I'd built as Grace, every relationship and achievement had been real, but it had been built on the foundation of forced forgetting, of survival through amnesia. The judge ruled in my favor, finding that Richard had fraudulently obtained custody through bribery and falsified documents. The adoption was nullified on grounds that it had been procured through illegal means. The judge ordered Richard to pay damages for psychological harm, though the amount was less than my lawyer had sought. More importantly, the judge's ruling was a public document acknowledging what Richard had done. Acknowledging that Elizabeth had been right to fear him. Acknowledging that I'd been stolen from my mother and given to my abuser through systematic corruption. Richard appealed, but the appellate court upheld the decision. He lost his reputation and his standing in the community. People who'd known him for decades learned he'd bribed a social worker and falsified child abuse reports. Sharon filed for divorce, saying she couldn't stay married to someone who'd lied to her for 30 years. Richard ended up alone in the house where he'd kept me captive to his false narrative for 25 years. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt exhausted and hollowed out. But I also felt free in a way I'd never experienced before. free from the lies and the forced forgetting, free from having to be Grace or Sophie or Natalie or any identity created through trauma. I could finally choose who I wanted to be without the weight of suppressed memories and manipulated history. Dr. Cross stayed with me throughout the legal process and the recovery of my memories. She said what I'd survived was extraordinary, and that rebuilding myself would take time. I asked her if she felt guilty for pushing Natalie in therapy back in 2010, for uncovering memories that made me flee. She admitted she'd carried guilt for 15 years, but now understood she'd been doing what needed to be done, that Natalie had come to her seeking answers and she'd helped provide them even though the answers were devastating. The difference was now I had support and resources that Natalie hadn't had. I wasn't running alone. I had Dr. Cross and my lawyer and a growing network of people who believed me. I started attending support groups for adult survivors of childhood abuse, heard stories from others who'd suppressed memories for decades, who'd been manipulated by abusers using the legal system as a weapon, who'd spent years running and hiding and creating new identities to escape trauma they couldn't consciously remember. I wasn't alone in this experience. My story was more extreme than most, but the core pattern was familiar. Systems designed to protect children being manipulated by abusers with money and influence. Survivors being labeled as crazy when they tried to tell the truth. The long shadow of childhood trauma extending into adulthood in ways that fragmented identity and derailed lives. I reconnected with Elizabeth's family, distant relatives who'd lost touch after her death. They told me stories about her that helped me understand who she'd been. Elizabeth had been young when she had me, only 23, and unprepared for single motherhood. But she'd loved me fiercely, had been willing to sacrifice everything to protect me from Richard. Her family had believed she was mentally ill because that's what Richard's reports had said. They'd distanced themselves, not wanting to enable her delusions. After I was taken away, Elizabeth had fallen apart completely, had stopped taking care of herself, had started drinking. By the time she died in 2007, she'd been alone for years, with everyone convinced she was the problem. Learning the truth about Richard's manipulation came too late for them to apologize to Elizabeth. But they welcomed me into the family, showed me photographs of her young and happy before everything fell apart. I looked at these images of my mother and felt overwhelming sadness for what we'd both lost. We'd been separated by a system that claimed to protect children but had actually enabled my abuse. I placed flowers on Elizabeth's grave and told her I knew the truth now, that I understood she'd been trying to save me, that I was sorry for all the years I'd believed the lies about her, that I hoped she'd found peace even though justice had come too late for her to see it. I legally changed my name to Natalie Elizabeth Brenner, reclaiming both my original first name and my mother's. Grace Ashford no longer existed. Sophie Dunn was gone. I was Natalie now, with full knowledge of who I'd been and what I'd survived. Dr. Cross helped me integrate all my fragmented identities into one coherent sense of self. The process was painful because it meant accepting that parts of my life as Grace had been real while the foundation was false. My friendships and achievements belonged to me regardless of the name I'd used. But my relationship with Richard and Sharon had been built on abuse and lies. Letting go of those familial bonds felt like another kind of death. My real family had been Elizabeth, who'd died alone thinking she'd failed me. I started writing about my experience not for publication but for processing. Hundreds of pages documenting the recovered memories and the legal battle and the slow work of rebuilding identity after systematic trauma. Dr. Cross suggested I might eventually want to share my story publicly to help other survivors. But for now, it was private, a way of claiming my narrative after having it controlled by others for 3 decades. 1 year after the judge's ruling, I was living in a new city under my chosen name, working remotely and building a life that belonged entirely to me. I still had nightmares sometimes about basements and locked doors. Still had moments of dissociation where I'd forget which identity I was supposed to be. But these episodes were getting less frequent. I'd learned that healing wasn't linear, that some days were harder than others, that the impact of childhood trauma didn't disappear just because you'd recovered the memories and won the legal case. Dr. Cross and I stayed in touch. She'd become more than my therapist. She'd become the person who'd witnessed my transformation from fragmented survivor to integrated whole. She'd stuck with me through the darkest revelations and never stopped believing my memories were real. I asked her once if she'd been afraid of being wrong, of falsely accusing Richard and destroying a family based on implanted memories. She said she'd been terrified, but the evidence supported my recovered memories. That Jennifer's confession and Richard's payment records and the pattern of my repeated escapes all corroborated what I was remembering. That she'd trusted me to know my own truth even when that truth was devastating. 3 years after finding me, after insisting I was her patient who'd disappeared 15 years ago, Dr. Cross attended my graduate school graduation where I received my degree in social work. I'd decided to dedicate my life to helping other survivors navigate the systems that had failed me, to become the advocate I'd needed when I was 3 years old and being evaluated by a corrupt social worker. Dr. Cross hugged me afterward and said she was proud of who I'd become despite everything I'd survived. I told her I was grateful she'd recognized me that day in her office, that her certainty about my identity had set everything in motion, that without her I might have lived as Grace forever, never knowing why I felt incomplete, never understanding the nightmares and the gaps in my memory, never recovering the truth about Elizabeth and Richard and myself. She'd given me back my history, and that gift was worth all the pain it had cost to receive it. We stood together looking at my diploma with Natalie Elizabeth Brenner printed across the bottom, a name that finally belonged to someone whole. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too, so subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.